Good evening. My name is Dr. Adam Johnsick, and I'm a psychotherapist at My Therapy NYC. I'm going to be talking tonight about storytelling. We're going to be doing a webinar, and I'm looking forward to it. I just wanted to introduce a little bit about the technicalities of the program that we're using. It's a live webinar. You can interact yourself with the chat screen at the bottom right of the screen. Any questions that you ask is anonymous. They'll be only seen by our administrative staff here. There's also going to be a poll that you can be part of throughout the course of the webinar, and we're going to discuss the poll at the end. And so with that, why don't we go ahead and get started? So, when you think of storytelling, many things could come to mind. Maybe a children's book, or maybe a plot of a movie or a play, and maybe even the story of your life, your work, or your family. Over the past several years, as a psychologist and a therapist and working with a company called Narrative Incorporated, I've learned a lot about storytelling and the effects that telling stories can have on the lives of those who tell and those who listen to stories. Specifically, in developing programs for students and from listening to therapy clients tell their stories, I found that the simple practice can change the way you experience life. The webinar tonight is designed to offer you a new way of looking at your stories, the ones that make you who you are. I want to provide an example of how the stories we tell ourselves and others can change, and how just the act of telling a new story can lead to improvements in our lives. So for this presentation, I'll cover just 3 main points. First, you have many stories. When you put them all together, they kind of make up who you are. Second, sometimes the stories we tell may no longer fit our actual experiences, and these stories may even hide the real, authentic, or current stories of our lives. And finally, finding your hidden stories, the ones that are connected to your real, current experiences, can change the way you feel. So we'll start with point 1. I was born in the Midwest in the 1970s. I went to a college at a large public university where I studied and researched psychology. I finished graduate school in New York City, where I live with my wife and our Australian shepherd, Milo. I work as a therapist, a counselor, a teacher, and I also design programs for college students. On my way to the office the other day, I was walking out of my apartment building, and a man I had seen many times, but I had never spoken to, yelled from across the street, "Hey, where's Milo?" He ran across the street and introduced himself to me. I learned his mother lived in the neighborhood and she loved dogs. She had met Milo before, and they had seen me walking him. He wanted me to meet me, and so he came over and introduced himself. We spoke for about 20 minutes, and we talk regularly now. So the story you just heard about me provides a good example of what I mean when I say we have more than just one story to tell. You can think of each of these statements as kind of like a story in and of itself. The set of stories composed of smaller sub-stories, each with a beginning, a middle, and an end. So there's the sub-story about how I was born in the Midwest in the 1970s. This story could be broken down even further with aspects of my experience as a child and my family. It could feature descriptions of the block that I lived on, which was a perfect square with farm-type homes from the early 1900s and late 1800s, arranged in a grid. And within this story, I could also describe spending parts of each day practicing the cello for much of my childhood, in lessons and then in cello performances. I could cover the process of switching high schools, graduating from a very small school with only 50 people in my graduating class. The story I just told also contains the sub-story of my college experience, living in dorms, but still being within walking distance of my childhood home. The story of having begun doing research very early in my college, but finally deciding on graduate training in practical psychology and psychotherapy. There's even the story of how I met my wife, and how we found our dog, Milo. Finally, one aspect of the story I just told gives a snapshot into something that happened to me currently in my neighborhood when my dog facilitated a connection with a person with whom I didn't have a connection before. The point is, each of the stories compose part of my larger story, and each can be told in many different ways. The story I tell, for example, about growing up in the Midwest may be very different today than it was about 10 years ago when I moved to New York City. Further, the many stories I have, the ones that I choose to tell, can be influenced by routine or expectation, and by who's listening and how well they're listening to me. And as a side note, as you continue to listen to the webinar, you may think about some of the different stories that you tell about yourself, and other stories that you may wish to tell. We'll discuss it at the end of the webinar. So, routine versus real stories. People are creatures of habit. Typically, we have certain sets of things that we do during the day that become predictable. We often set our alarm to wake up at the same time. We may have a morning routine that is streamlined to ensure that we get to work on time. We often have an exercise routine, maybe even a weekend routine. The stories we tell ourselves are the same way. As just mentioned, we have many different stories, but the ones we focus on or tell can become routine or chosen in a regular way, often influenced by social or family expectations, internal narratives, stereotypes, things that are kind of imposed by the culture that's surrounding us. And what's more, sometimes those stories that have become so routine, they can cover up more real kind of current stories. Ultimately, I have found that this type of routine story may not represent who we actually are, how we want to actually experience our world, and may not represent the direction we would like to be going in our lives. For example, for many years I've worked in student and academic affairs, in particular advising college students about curriculum, major choices, educational and career identity development. At one of the colleges I have worked, there's a prevailing business culture, as business majors are the most popular at the school. One of the routine stories that the students often tell themselves at the school is that in order to get a job after school, one must major in either accounting or finance. This routine story is so pervasive that students will often come to believe that it is impossible to get a job without one of those two majors, accounting or finance. This story in turn creates high stress and high emotion interactions in the meetings I have with the students who do not qualify for the major. These students are expected to choose a major in the liberal arts. Such students are sad, anxious, angry, confused, largely due to the routine story of the school that may or may not actually apply to them when they're actually looking for jobs. As a side note, most CEOs of Fortune 500 companies had liberal arts majors in college, a fact that debunks this routine story that's prevalent at this school. So often in advisement sessions, when I witness students feeling disconnected from their own educational experience, trying and failing to live up to the expectation that the story of their college life would be that of an accounting or finance major. When we start to discuss other options, I almost always find out new and interesting things about each student, real stories about who they are, about what they're doing in their lives, and stories that aren't being told and that aren't being heard. Pedro, for example, and I've changed his name, and I've changed some details of his story to protect his confidentiality, but he was an accounting major and a single father of a 3-year-old boy living in New York City with a 2.5-hour commute to the school. Pedro had taken calculus, which was a requirement for accounting, 2 times, failing each time. But in the rest of his classes, he got A's and B's, mostly political science classes and public affairs classes. In session, we spoke about his self-imposed expectation that he should finish his degree in accounting so that he could support his son and do well. It started to sound a lot to me like a routine story in the school. With some exploring in our advisement sessions, I listened to other important stories, real stories in Pedro's life, that he had started his own nonprofit organization, that he had worked on advocacy programs for a local charter school, and was ultimately passionate about public affairs. These real stories, Pedro had not organized, not told himself or other people, but with space and with listening, he made the decision to tell his real story and switch his major to public affairs. He graduated and now runs a charter school, partly because he explored beyond his routine story. So, what happens when the story we tell ourselves or others is more of a routine story and less of an individually meaningful real story? I've noticed people start to feel disconnected and generally less well. In therapy, at the beginning, routine stories are often told. Clients present these routine stories dictated by social, family, or personal expectations, cultural or gender stereotypes, often leading to the feelings that bring them to therapy in the first place. With time, it becomes easy to detect a routine story. If a client begins to tell a routine story, it may start with a phrase like, well, I'm the type of person that blank, or my partner always expects me to blank. We've all told these stories before, and as a therapist, it's when a story begins like this that I begin to wonder if there is another real story that maybe it's kind of right under the surface and kind of much more authentic and true to real experience that's kind of waiting to be told. So what helps to uncover real stories? I found that it really depends on who's listening and how they listen. In the world we live in today, everyone is always on the go, headphones in, eyes focused on the smartphones, talking on the phone, looking at Facebook, generally existing in multiple different locations and media all at once. This being the case, it's not a surprise that we are almost never fully present with each other. And if we are listening at all, our listening is split between many other tasks. In fact, there are whole fields of psychology that say that listening to one another and listening well will change the way a relationship works. I've come to believe that what we tell in a story is shaped by the quality of the listening by those who are being told the story. It's about setting a space with stillness and safety and finding those who will listen well. Overall, there are many ways to tell stories. And we all want to, and we all need to. As the experts at Narrative Incorporated taught me, a part of the human experience for millennia, and indeed, our brain, is hardwired for stories. Some people tell their stories around the dinner table with their families. Some people tell with friends on a Friday or Saturday night. Others tell their stories through spoken word, through poetry, journaling, noveling. And some people perform their stories on the stage or on screen. Sometimes the places we find to tell our stories become prohibitive and constraining. And this is when we begin to feel stuck. Stuck and confined, beholden to the routine stories that we have. It's at this point that it's best to explore what is not being told, and do that in a safe place with a good listener. Once you have a safe place and a good listener, it's also about finding the courage to identify your real stories. We each have an authentic, experienced story, one that is connected to our actions, our thoughts, and our emotions. You may start by asking yourself, what are the stories in my life that I've been telling, and those that I do not feel connected to? What are some of the ways and some of the things that you do, or ways that you feel, those stories that aren't being told? And as you explore these questions, finding the story that you need to tell, and then telling it, is only a short ways away. And I wish you well in your journey. So now, on to the poll question. What story in your life would you like to change or retell? It looks like most of the people who answered the poll answered that they would like to change that they're a perfectionist. In fact, about 45% of the people who answered the poll said that they would like to change that they're a perfectionist. So if the routine story is that you're a perfectionist, I would say, what are some of the underlying stories that may be actually happening that could maybe be counter to that routine story? Again, routine stories aren't all 100% wrong. It's not that they're incorrect, but they may not be connected fully to what you're actually experiencing. I would recommend that you think of a time when you kind of labeled yourself a perfectionist, when you told that routine story. What did it mean? What actually happened? What were the things that happened when you were labeling yourself a perfectionist? You may find that there were other things going on as well, other things that may be contrary to your routine story that you are a perfectionist. We can do that with many routine stories, and I hear all sorts of different routine stories in therapy and in the programming that I do. Some of the routine stories are here: I'm a perfectionist, I'm needy, I'm too emotional, I'm disorganized. These are the stories that we tell ourselves, or that we come to understand as kind of truth, even though they may not actually be 100% kind of connected to our experience anymore. Black sheep of the family, the breadwinner of the family, I'm a workaholic, I'm lazy. These are all routine stories, things that pull us away from our actual experiences and may cover up some of the stories that are more connected to your actual real life. So with that, I'd like to ask, are there any questions? So one question comes from Rachel. It says, what happens if I feel like I don't really have a story? Well, Rachel, there are a lot of people that kind of feel like they don't have a story. And I guess the answer is, when you think carefully about it, everybody has a story. And it's about finding a place and finding a safe spot and finding a way to feel comfortable telling it. In fact, you have many stories. You have many stories that start from when you were, maybe before you were born. Many of the stories that we tell in some of the programs that we run are about our ancestors. And through the history of mankind, a lot of the stories that are passed on are about different people that inform who we are. You do have stories, and that's central to who we are as people. Bob asks, I feel like my story is too personal, and what should I do? Stories are personal, and this is one of the reasons why finding a place that's a safe place and a calm place where you can really tell the stories that you need to tell is very important. The way your stories come out are going to be changed by who's listening and how they're listening. Finding a place where you can tell the very personal stories that you may need to tell, though sometimes they're the most important, is of utmost importance. And that's why I encourage you to really do some work to find that place. And with that, I'd like to end the webinar, or at least end the question section. And I'll end by saying, again, I work for My Therapy NYC. It's a counseling and wellness service in the Flatiron District of Manhattan. There are many different services. There are individuals counseling. There's couples counseling. There are all sorts of workshops and webinars. There are webinars from previous dates that are available on the website. There are resources for those of you who would like to look into different types of opportunities and different types of resources related to mental health and wellness. And we encourage you to contact us. If you have any questions or you'd like to hear more, don't hesitate to email us. Thank you very much, and have a good night.